what can we do to get this conversation going? Or like, because so many times when I try to engage, I'm also told, don't do it. It's a waste of your time, which I do find it is often. Like, can we go there, do you think? Or are we like stuck in grade 8? Or I'm not even, actually, no, I'm not even going to put that to you. What can we do to change the conversation? Because I think anything is possible if we put in enough.
James is more moderate than me. He's more level-headed, so I'll let him lead with this one.
Excellent.
I'm a little bit stoic when it comes to conversations. I guess removing the emotion, that's my suggestion first, is that a lot of the times, so if somebody does engage a little bit, and if they try to attack you for like your character or this or that, or they throw a label on there, I don't engage with that. I try to just refocus on like, well, what do you mean by this? And like kind of don't let it get into that, because as soon as you feed into that, it just amplifies into a big, just, it's a punching match at that point. And so I think that's part of it, is accurately framing somebody's position. And on our side as well, like when we're engaging in a conversation, what I try to do is I try to understand somebody's position, and I will steelman that. So present their position in the best possible light, and then poke a hole in it and say, this is where it fails. And if you can do that, then that shows that you've actually understood what they're trying to communicate.
Good day, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Dialogue Over Division. And today I have two of my friends from Critical Compass podcast. I have James and Mike with me, and we're going to do things a little bit different, where they're going to be asking me some questions about the podcast, my background, and I hope to have a very open and respectful discussion. And I say that for a reason, because that's what I think we're all trying to create here. And so that's going to be one of the key topics that we're going to talk about today, is where did things kind of break down and how we can have some healing, maybe we'll put it. So thank you guys for doing this. I think this is going to be a lot of fun. So I'll turn it over to you if you guys could give a bit of an introduction.
Well, thanks so much, Eva. I'm Mike from the Critical Compass, and pleasure to be chatting with you today. Thanks for carving out some time for us. I think today we'll just have a little bit of a discussion. We're going to be posting this on both of our channels, so we'll do a little bit of I don't think we need to introduce you too much. Probably the people who follow us follow you as well, but we can have some good back and forth, I think, and I think James probably has a couple good ones to start. So you go ahead, James.
Yeah, I guess part of us starting the Critical Compass was to kind of share our journey of exploring these issues, like how do you navigate and find what is true, and that requires dialogue. And I think many of us have come from a journey where we've used to think a certain way, and we used to have certain assumptions about like how Canada worked, how our institutions worked, and that has shifted over time. And I'm curious, what were some key moments that kind of like being in law, what were some key moments that maybe shifted you towards this public role of kind of speaking out and kind of trying to, maybe you're sticking up for these so-called freedom fighters, but for a lack of better words,
Thanks for the question. And it's so funny that I find it so incredibly strange, two things that have come out of this. People paint me with some ideology that, in my view, is not at all correct. And then also to being in the public eye. This is not something that I expected at all in the last few years or ever, really. But especially the part with the ideology is what I'd like to talk about more too, because I thought you were going there at first. And I've said this before on podcasts, is I've been previously I used to work as a landowner lawyer, so representing landowners in Alberta against big oil and gas companies. And we know Alberta Energy's big industry, and or the government, when the government was taking land from landowners. And I was called a tree hugger then. And now I'm representing citizens of Canada where their personal rights are allegedly being violated. And now I'm being called a right-wing extremist. Like, I've gone from one end of the spectrum to the other. And I don't think I'm either. I think I'm somewhere in the middle. And particularly when I'm representing people that have been harmed or injured, it's not necessarily my ideology either. That's the work that I'm doing. So there's been so much confusion about that, which I find so interesting just to observe. One thing I don't think I've said publicly is I've probably voted every single different party that is available in Canada. So here you get that time. And like, to always be labeled a conservative, which I don't mind being called that now. I'm getting more involved as I make publicly aware with a party, because I want to become more civically active and engaged, because I'm recognizing the importance of it. But that's another thing that, like, it just is so strange when you put yourself out there publicly, how quickly people are ready to paint you with this or that. And I hope we get into this, but maybe I'll just start with it, is this whole dialogue over division. To me, it's having a conversation. I enjoy conversations. I don't understand how we've gotten here. And I invited one person, Max Fawcett, to come on the show. And I have to say, I was incredibly nervous starting it because I didn't want to be yelled at, basically. I was like, I'm doing this because I think it's important that we have a conversation, but I didn't want to be yelled at. In the end, obviously, he didn't yell at me. And I think he recognized that I'm not some lunatic. We had quite a nice conversation, I think. Of course, we had very different ideas about things, but we had a respectful conversation. What happened after, unfortunately, he just maintained that same behavior as before our conversation, where he was on my case about this or that. And I'm like, I don't have the time to respond to every post or commentary you make. I'm more prepared to have a conversation like adults. Like, I don't know why things have become so short and, labeled, instead of let's just have a conversation like people used to do once upon a time.
I think maybe in modern, maybe Twitter influenced culture, everyone's so focused on trying to get that, 140 or 280 character quip, that perfectly worded, just slice right through the heart. And they take that into the real world with them, where it doesn't belong.
And don't get me wrong, I like those like short characters, like straight to the heart ones once in a while. But I post long format at Twitter as well, because I think there's an opportunity to engage there as well and to help elevate and educate. But that's not the place to have an actual conversation. I don't very often have back and forths with people, because I don't find that's productive. Like, even texting with your friends, sometimes the conversation goes off. Why would I do that with perfect strangers on a public forum? Like, maybe people should think about that a little bit too. But anyway, so that one, I really tried, and I thought that maybe it would open more opportunities, and maybe it will still.
Sorry to interrupt. One thing I've observed is sometimes people in these conversations, they're actually having a conversation with what they think you believe, rather than actually addressing what you believe outright. And that's where I'm always curious to, if somebody uses a term, well, we got to define that term. We got to agree that we're actually talking about the same thing. If not, sometimes you can be talking past each other. You could be missing the mark just because you haven't actually decided that you're focused on the same thing. And then you mentioned that you're labeled alt-right or right-wing just because now you've kind of helped defend some citizens for their rights who are not on the left now. But what happens is people subscribe a whole other subset of beliefs onto these labels. This middle ground is something where if you ask a lot of people, the average person's somewhere in the middle on like a lot of issues. I feel like there's a little bit more commonality than there are differences. And you see this, if you talk about immigration, just as one little example, most people think that there should be a limit, because if you ask people, well, in Canada, should we have 10 million people move in 2025? People say, oh, that's too much. So all we're disagreeing with right now is where should the limit be, rather than like, because everybody has a limit. It's just we're disagreeing about the exact number of it. And often these things get framed in black and white terms, and we need more of that nuance and kind of this shared understanding.
Well, I think that's such a great example too. And it's not, for me at least, it's not just the amount of people, because I don't think I have enough information to even comment on that. Like, what it is, I think, is how it affects people. And for me, everything I do, and don't get me wrong, some of the clients that I have, I very much believe in the ideology as well, but it's all about holding the government to account. So if we have the information about, okay, we're going to bring in X many immigrants, wonderful, great. Like, I understand Canada was built on immigrants as well, with immigrants, but they need the facilities to live as well. So let's just ensure that we're doing this responsibly. And then let's have a conversation about how many people but first and foremost, perhaps elected officials, you should be listening and talking to the citizens that are already here and what their concerns are, what their issues are, what their fears are. Let's just talk about them. And that's where I think that there's been this is what's causing a bit of the gap and the lack of trust in our public and institutions, is I've been seeing more so recently, elected officials are talking at us rather than with us or to us. They're just saying, this is what we're doing, the end. And not even sometimes saying why, which would be helpful and would be nice. But ideally, it would be, what are your thoughts on this? And wow, I think that would transform things. I think that would start getting people more civically engaged. That would also start building trust and repairing that bridge that we have that's quite open right now. And then I wonder whether it's sometimes done on purpose or not. So maybe they just like doing their work, over there and not bothering. But I think it's also on us to get involved.
Yeah, it makes me, the way that I think we've talked about this on our show before, where it almost feels sometimes like maybe, if you want to say that there's a government media apparatus of some type that kind of maybe focuses and keeps, pretty tight control of the messaging, it almost feels like they don't want us to discuss these types of things because this is giving them the benefit of the doubt, that they don't want the conversation to go off the rails and be like, if you start talking about limiting immigration, then before you know it, people will be talking about, they'll be saying racist things about, Muslim immigrants or something. Like they go way too far the other way, as if you couldn't have any nuanced discussion in the middle there that has nothing to do with either race or religion or anything like that, but is surely simply a practical conversation on the sheer number.
Right. 100%. And I like that you brought up the media and how it's kind of captured, or worse. And, with everything that's occurred over the last 4 years that has been highlighted with the problems, I think it's also great. I'm a forever optimist, or however you say it, because I also see that it's caused a lot of people to do things that they probably wouldn't have. For example, me doing this podcast, yourselves doing yours. And I think that's good, and I think that's healthy and helpful. So it really exposes things as well. And I think just today the CBC had, or somebody reported that the CBC had like the worst viewership it ever had in a long time, with the $1.5 billion and the amount of content creators that they have there. So that goes to show you the power that we have all the time if we're willing to take some ownership.
I wanted to ask you a quick question. Sorry, James. Just to go back for a second, based on what you were saying earlier in your career when you were being accused of being a tree hugger versus now where you're alt-right. Do you find any difference in the degree or severity of either the media or the or just kind of intrapersonal, like people who speak against you? Like, do you find it was any more or less vitriolic on either side?
Wow. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. So that's a really interesting and good question. With the landowner work, it didn't, because it doesn't affect you personally, or people personally. I don't think it didn't ever get as much attention as anything to do with the COVID mandates and restrictions and all of that stuff. So I didn't see the media being particularly vitriolic. It was more reporting the facts, but it just didn't get as much viewership. There was some, and some were more controversial, some of the projects, so they got more press and attention. But in terms of anything to do with the COVID and mandates and vaccines, wow, has it been, obviously, as we've all seen, vitriolic. And take it even a step further is, I don't do criminal law, but the criminal lawyers that got involved in Tamara Leach's case, Chris Barber's, Pat King, and the others, they've said, I think publicly too, is that they've never received so much hate mail and vitriol that they've seen, and they represent murderers and rapists and pedophiles. So that goes, I think that really highlights maybe where you were going to, how like there it just became so built up, and it was just acceptable to call people criminal, really bad criminal allegations. Like, to call somebody terrorist, in my view, is not something you say lightly. That's incredibly serious. And that word was being thrown around like it was nothing. And nobody stopped it. Nobody in a position of power stopped it. In fact, they encouraged it, and the media allowed it and encouraged it. And I think that is so wrong.
So I've noticed two parallels, because right now you have an apparatus which is declaring a moral high ground and then saying what is right and what is wrong. And I think the average person, they fall into that, and it's almost like they're on autopilot, just kind of attacking what is wrong because they feel it's morally justified at this point. And the first problem, or the first part of this, is that not everybody has the time and attention we physically can't learn everything. We can't jump into everything. We can't understand every single issue that pops up. So we have to defer to experts to a certain point. Yeah. But we've exported almost too much of our thinking and too much to experts that we don't really have a bearing of where we are kind of on an individual level. If you think about the average person kind of sleepwalks throughout their day, they're on their phone, the general amount of awareness about what they're either putting in their bodies, what they're eating, what they're doing, their habits, their sleep, it's not there because most people are not aware of kind of their moment-to-moment life. So the people that are on autopilot in this case are kind of put on autopilot in a political sense. And we saw that with COVID, but we also see that in this world of the DEI, the diversity, equity, and inclusion, where we're told some supposed truths about how the world works, that the world is split into like oppressed versus oppressor. And because of that, we are able to demonize certain groups because they are part of the problem, and we don't have to treat them like we would other groups because it's justified to demonize a group if they are morally in the wrong, according to that ideology. So I've noticed a couple parallels there, even though these belief structures are kind of still in their own vacuums. The way that it manifests is similar. I'm not sure if you've noticed that as well.
Well, on the moral bit, I think that there's so much going on there. But what I would comment on is that I think that this is why I've chosen to do what I'm doing, is I'm really trying to educate first and foremost, because I see that people are having these heated discussions, debates, and disagreements over things that aren't even correct sometimes. And like one good example, I think, is the mandates federally versus provincially versus employers. And nobody has taken the time, and this is where I think the media really failed the most, maybe, or the government itself, or maybe the people. Again, I can't figure it out still, but that there's been so much confusion about it. For example, like we put out, I have 2 class actions that I'm involved in Alberta. And one is for businesses that lost, that had damages over the mandates in Alberta because the mandates were found to be illegal. And then one was for vaccine injured people. And then people are like, what about my employer? I lost my job. And I'm not mad, but it just goes to show me that it's unfortunate because people don't understand the relationship of how there was a mandate imposed on them and who they can seek damages from. And nobody cares to help educate them. And I also see the same thing during like the convoy or something. Somebody said something about the mandates, and then somebody responds, "You idiot, it was federal mandates that the federal government wired. These were provincial." And I'm just like, there were federal, but like, we can't keep, I can't obviously correct everyone, but it's just unfortunate that nobody in the media is like, okay, let's make sure we're all clear on this, or the government was very clear with it. Clearly, somebody didn't do their job that had a big platform, because the amount of confusion out there it's unfortunate.
Yeah, or you could say that the institution that we have in place right now did a very good job in not letting people know about those things.
Well, and that's kind of where I go with the chicken and the egg. Is that the goal? So that then nobody's holding them to account. Everyone's confused, scratching their heads. What do we do? Who do we sue? Who do we question? So that is the chicken and the egg. And then if that is the case, then look in the mirror is my answer. You need to educate yourself and elevate yourself, which I think that for everyone in the end, because if they did a very good job with that, and then this is the outcome, this is really what they want, like a society that's mad at each other and hating each other, and families divided and friends lost. This is what you wanted. This is the leader you want to be, and you want this to be your legacy. Okay. If I was in charge, I would want more people to be elevated and holding me to account and asking me questions and saying, hey, maybe we could do this. Maybe we should do that. Because then I think in the end, it's beneficial for everyone. But I don't see that happening right now.
Yeah, we were mentioning a little bit before we hit record here about people, rather than kind of sitting around and not doing anything, then just whining about stuff, actually taking a stand and taking the responsibility for educating yourself. And what we had during, specifically, it became very obvious in the COVID years. You could probably point to times before that where it was still present in the, I'm going to say the term media apparatus again. I don't know why I'm saying that. I've never said that before in my life, but the media apparatus was very during COVID was very clear about the fact that if you were somebody who wanted to quote unquote do your own research, you were an extremist of some type. You were right wing. You were an anti-science, anti-vaxxer. You were all these different names if you wanted to educate yourself on anything other than what was being told to you through very, very mainstream channels. So I think probably what that does is it probably has like a knock-on effect for other, if I'm not supposed to question, what are in these medical products, well, then I'm also not supposed to question the invocation of the Emergencies Act. And I'm also not supposed to question all these other things that, that the government does or that an institution does. And then you end up with an apathetic population.
Yeah, well, I think that we were already, and sure, that is what people were saying. And I was reading things and then being accused of misinformation. I'm like, literally, I just forwarded something that was in the Wall Street Journal. Like, that was a while ago. And yeah, that does happen. There's a comedian that said, when they were saying that used to be called reading. When they said, why are you doing your own research? That's reading. And if we're going to allow somebody to suggest we can't read and inform ourselves, again, for me, it's look in the mirror. Why wouldn't you take the opportunity to inform yourself and learn from yourself and understand? And maybe this goes back, it's a funny story of how I went into law, because I think this is the reason when somebody asked me is my mom had 3 traffic violations, and she's Polish background or born in Poland. So her English is not great. And I'm like, okay, mom, I'll go with you to the courthouse, because she was going to fight the tickets. And I'm first year university, I think. And the prosecutor was so dismissive and just kind of waved at us and yelled, just pay half of the tickets and go away. And we're like, but so did she do something wrong? Why? And I just didn't like it. I thought that was so uncomfortable. I didn't think it was really fair or just, and it's supposed to be justice. And I was like, okay, I'm not going to let that happen again. So I think I'm going to go to law school. And that was kind of how I made my decision, because I didn't like the feeling of being uncomfortable there. And somebody kind of maybe taking advantage, maybe not. I don't know if that was a good deal, but I just didn't like it. And I decided to go to law school.
Yeah, in that case, you're kind of seeing how it almost seems like maybe that judge, how many of those cases do they see a day? Like, if you have apathy in that part of the institution, and does that breed an engaged citizens, or would your mom get apathetic after that? Like, that's not building trust in that institution from the people. If that's their experience, it's not helping. So
yeah, well, and then my mom came from communist Poland, so she saw crazy control of government that you had no choice with anything. So that would probably there she wasn't too concerned, but then when things were happening over COVID, she was, definitely not comfortable with the direction Canada was taking, and how people didn't really see or notice or question it either.
That's an interesting comment, because I remember reading some posts by, you're familiar with Roman Baber?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I read, that was sort of the first thing I read during COVID, where I was like, this is interesting. Somebody who's quite literally come from a country with a history of communism, whose family has experienced it.
Yeah.
And yeah, when I looked into it, I saw more and more people saying similar things. Michael Malice was saying a similar thing. His family's Ukrainian. So do you think that not only in your decision to go to law school, but where you find yourself now, do you think that kind of family background of I don't know, it's not genetic, but an inherent sort of opposition to authoritarianism, is that has that powered you through a little bit?
Yeah, I don't know if it was that, because when I went to law school, I didn't expect again to be taking on these kind of files and clients and cross-examining the prime minister. Like, there were people in law school that probably would have wanted to do that a lot more. The ones that were, eager beavers. And I was there to learn, and I was going to figure things out later. So I didn't have some great expectations of challenging the government in any way, shape, or form. But I think it goes to like how vulnerable my mom and I felt. And then the people I represent generally are pretty vulnerable. And I'll even use the crazy word oppressed, like landowners against huge oil and gas companies. Who's got the upper hand? Who's got the resources? Who's got the ability to navigate the legal regulatory system? Obviously, oil company. Same with government on the landowner side as well. Then this is the first time I've done things of this nature. Like, I don't think there's many lawyers that did this. One thing people need to understand too is a lot of charter challenges, personal right issues that have come up in Canada. Quite often, it has to do with criminal law, because it's how far did it go with the accused or the charter rights breached. Not always, but that is somewhere where a lot of it is challenged. So then we learn from that experience, okay, how far do our rights extend? How far can the government go? And through those cases, we learn. But it's not like, Canada is built on a ton of these precedents from people challenging. And we were talking about this a little bit early before we started recording, is that's one thing I think is healthy and good, especially in a democracy and a society as young as Canada, is we need to challenge these things in court so that it's out in the open. We talk about it. We see how far the courts think the government should go. Then we have an opportunity to elect people based on that information and how they take those decisions. One thing with the States is they're incredibly litigious. They always have been compared to Canada. And I think that's healthy, and I think it's good because people are standing up for their rights, questioning these things. And it's important to have that information, knowledge, case law, understanding, precedents. All those things are good and helpful, because sometimes we're kind of like, am I going too far? I don't know. And we don't ever figure it out.
Yeah, it seems like without those mechanisms, or without that being tested very often, you can go a lot too far without finding where these edges should be. And in the States, they're going to be testing it. They're sampling and they're testing it out more frequently. So they're going to be constantly in this push pull of where the edges really, really are. And I think we know that, like, given the fact that governments can create money out of thin air and with these ultimately unlimited pockets, I think there's a natural tendency for government to expand and to push the limits. And you'll never see a government department consolidate and like downsize itself if not for like outside pressures. So there's no self-limiting factor. And I feel like in the States, their constitution has more self-limiting built in, and Canada is maybe a little bit more lacking in that kind of, in those constraints.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think it's just so important to have those checks at some point anyway. And I don't see that we're really doing that. We are, but it's also, I don't find incredibly strategic sometimes too. We've seen Alberta now challenging the federal government a bit, and you could see that some of those cases take a long time. And I think that's good. It was very informative to both provinces and the federal government of how far they can go. And now moving forward, I think everyone has a clearer understanding. So again, just helpful, I think.
I'm glad James brought up the U.S. Constitution there, because I had a maybe this is a ridiculous question and it is a show unto itself, but I wanted to ask you something specifically about your thoughts on Section 1 of the Canadian Charter in comparison to the actual enshrined right to free speech in the US. Do you believe that when issues like COVID happen, do you think that the presence of Section 1 in our charter, subject to reasonable limits, do you think that that has a inherently limiting effect on anything that any normal citizen could ever possibly do to challenge an overreaching government? Like, do you think that we are always going to be kind of inherently hamstrung by that provision, or am I wrong with that?
What do you think?
I think yes.
That we are always hamstrung. Yeah.
Well, who defines what those reasonable kind of...
I was going to ask why. So that was your why. So I'm very excited for you guys to read my book, Reconnect to Canada, when it comes out, because I have a chapter on it. And this is one of the reasons I think education is the reason it is so important. And I was kind of tired of people calling the charter toilet paper. I understand that people feel that there has been a lack that with the charter protecting rights and freedoms. But it's interesting to hear your perspective, and that's why I asked you first, because there's a lot of cases where it did protect people's rights and freedoms. So COVID was a crazy time. And did it even, how many cases, can you name any cases where it actually went through the whole charter argument on a COVID case? Because
nothing that I can think of.
Didn't they get thrown out before that? Like a lot of these things, like they avoided pushing it that far, and kind of like the process is the punishment, and the pain of like...
I won't go that far, but yes.
I will.
Yes, kind of. Well, so I think the process is important. Being strategic and smart is also important. So the biggest example would be the Piqued challenge. So the one on mobility rights. Federal government says you can't travel. So the charter right of mobility right was never came into question, was never examined by the court, because the court found it was moot. People had the right to travel, and we shouldn't waste court resources on it. Do I agree with that decision? Not necessarily. But that's the decision. So it didn't go to a charter thing, and everyone's yelling about their charter rights. Yeah, I agree. And I really wish the court heard it so that we would have that discussion, so we would have that precedent.
Yeah.
There's probably a very good reason they didn't want to hear it, because how can you say people that couldn't travel didn't have their charter rights violated? So there's your answer, maybe, if you think it through without stopping at the first thing. With respect to the Emergencies Act, do you know what that decision said? It said it was unconstitutional and it violated charter rights. So what happened with Section 1? It didn't stop it didn't allow the government to do it. The court said, you guys went way too far. Of course, we know right now the federal government is challenging it. I don't think that's going to go anywhere. I could be wrong. But so there's two examples where, actually one example where it succeeded and one where it just didn't have that scrutiny. And there's tons of examples of charter applications at the Supreme Court where, either they said yes or no, but it went through a serious Section 1 charter scrutiny. So yeah, I get the frustration, but there's more to the picture. And that's where I was like, I never got into a debate with anybody on it online, because I'm like, I can't have this conversation with you. It needs to.
Yeah, you need 4 years of law school before we can have a.
Well, And there, actually, I disagree with you there. And that's why I wrote the book, because I think this is such important information for every Canadian. I really hope every Canadian reads my book when it's out, because it will just make everybody a little bit smarter.
That's good. And if it can make people a little bit more confident and maybe speaking up when
Yes.
something feels wrong, you know. And actually, to your point about Section 6, the mobility rights, that's what, you know, that meme on the internet of like, what radicalized you? This is what radicalized me. In the summer of 21, we were going to visit my wife's family in PEI. And that was right when they were doing this was before the vax passes, but they were doing the Maritime bubble.
Oh, God.
And do you remember that?
How is that constitutional?
Yeah, it was nonsense, right? And
Who
so I was
challenged that? Nobody.
exactly. And I wrote a big email, and maybe one day I'll find it. I wrote a huge email to the to the premier, and I don't think it got answered, but I laid out my rationale. I was like, this seems to go against Section 6. This seems to go against this and that. And what they were making you do at the time was essentially you were supposed to upload a picture of your vaccination records to this website that they created that had a database that was being hosted somewhere offshore. Like, it wasn't even a government site.
Awesome.
And I put all that in the email. I'm like, how am I supposed to know that, like, even if I was on board with this, which I'm not, how am I supposed to know that any information I upload to this site remains secure? It's not leaked somewhere else. This is not like a .gc or whatever .pei website. Yeah, it was a mess. It was a mess. And like, no one cared. They just did
I don't know if they cared, because this is what I'm learning the more I'm involved, is I think maybe sometimes they didn't even know.
Mm.
So, like, you might have brought up some points. They're like, oh, yeah, where are we storing this? If you look around, and I don't mean to be disrespectful or disparaging, but kind of look at some of the people that are elected officials. Again, I'm not trying to be disparaging, but if most regular Canadians, and I'd say most regular Canadians, don't really appreciate and understand these things, which is fair. Like we already talked about, this is not in their daily wheelhouse. Do you really expect elected officials that kind of have the same background to automatically know all these things when they get elected, particularly at a local level? That's what I'm learning a lot about, because right now there's been a lot of talk about the human rights and having washrooms like unisex or something. I really think that people in small communities don't understand. So they're like, oh, we don't want to be sued, so let's just do this. And that,
right.
The more I'm involved, the more I'm understanding that's actually the case. So you might have brought something to their attention that they didn't really know about, but privacy rights is something that possibly they didn't even consider.
Crazy.
So it's, I think elevating the conversation is so important.
So one thing I've noticed is there is a trend kind of in academia for hyper specialization, where people will take 6 years and they'll just dive deep and they'll be an expert in this one tiny little field. But if you go anywhere outside of that, they're functionally blind to how that interacts. Yeah. And I think you get a little bit of that with certain politicians, that they know their area super well, but we're lacking some there's a term called deep generalists. These are people who have a very deep practical sense of how the world works. And it's not just a surface level. They are ones who explore, and they have a feel for things. So it's not, I feel like if we had a few more of those in politics, that would just help glue things together. It would help kind of get people out of their silos. Because I think the deferring to experts are like, well, it's like, I don't know enough to even like do a little bit of critical thinking. So you defer it to somebody else, and there's no like checking up on it. There's no accountability. There's no, like, you 100% trust that this one random expert came to a certain conclusion. Like, well, what's the rationale in that? Like, how do we make sure that they're not just off because of their own biases? So we need more of this crosstalk.
It's incredibly important. And I think that's a detriment to what we see and what's gone on. And I think that extends of not just politics, and I hadn't really thought about it in politics, but I think you're spot on. But in science and in law, I see, like, we saw this during COVID. Again, going back to that, it was, if you weren't an immunologist, then you can't talk. And the immunologist is like, I don't know, the epidemiologist should be the one we're asking. The epidemiologist is like, I'm not a vaccinologist. The vaccinologist is like, no, it's public health, and who, like, that's, if you actually look at what happened, there was a lot of that. And if a lay person was in any of those, but the experts were pointing fingers at each other as well. And that's why I think you didn't see too many lawyers jumping up and taking these on, because these were incredibly complicated, high profile public issues as well, but very specialized too. So a lot of people are specialized in their practice. So why would they take away from their comfort and knowledge and then jump into something different? So I think that's across the board that's causing problem, unless you're a tradesperson that is supposed to be doing, maybe if you're an electrician, you shouldn't be jumping into plumbing. I think that's appropriate, but I think having a bit, I suspect an electrician can give you some good guidance on a plumbing, whereas in law, you almost don't. It's like, not my area, not my specialty, ask somebody else. And I don't think that's helpful. Like, then we don't build a house if nobody knows anything, with that same kind of analogy.
Yeah, it feels like it maybe has to do with the stakes and the whole CYA aspect of it, maybe from a law perspective. But it's funny you say that, because I was going to say we need more general contractors in the government rather than drama teachers. But
I think we need no drama teachers in government, because I don't think they add anything to the government.
Yeah. So well, I'm curious what you think about. So then, with all that said, what do you think about? I don't know if I could point to an example of a lawyer. Well, maybe I could. Isn't Timothy Caulfield? Isn't he technically a political? Isn't he technically a lawyer? He's not a medical.
He blocked me, but he's a lawyer.
Yeah. Like, what do you think about the lawyers and the doctors and the hospitalists who were on TV saying things like, the hospitalist who, what's his name? Boghossian? Is that his name? He was on like CTV every night. Ian Boghossian, I think his name is something like that.
I didn't watch it from the beginning, obviously, but I think, great. You want to make your opinion? Great. But you should also have somebody to challenge that opinion.
Yeah.
I say, wonderful. If you're that confident, Mr. Caulfield, about how awesome vaccines are, you should be able to have that conversation with people who don't think vaccines are that awesome, especially if you're paid to do it. Then have that conversation, so we're not misinformed, these dummies on this side, as you seem to think. And like, I didn't really care so much about him and his narrative, but then I did get a bit miffed and annoyed, because I challenged him one time and then he immediately blocked me, then unblocked me to tell me, I don't know who you are and why you're bothering me or whatever. And if he knows anybody in the province, and I'm not trying to be hoity, he should know who I am, because I launched a class action in Alberta about vaccine injured people. He's talking about vaccines being safe and effective, and here's a lawsuit where the representative plaintiff has a vaccine injury. Perhaps we can have a conversation about that.
Yeah, you'd think maybe he could take a little bit of that 6 or 7 figure grant for combating vaccine misinformation and put his money where his mouth is. But I just, as you were talking there, sorry, I looked up. It's Isaac Boghossian. That's his name. He was the guy on TV all the time. I'm pretty sure on Global or CTV, saying things like, every industry except for food delivery should be shut down. Everyone should be forced to stay at home. And so you've got these people who are ostensibly experts in their field.
What was his background? What was his background?
Well, he is he's a specialist in tropical diseases and HIV. So yeah, but he had a lot of opinions on how we should shut down the country and the economy.
Yeah. Okay. Well, maybe you're not an economist or a government official. So maybe just talk about the tropical disease. Like, why did everyone else was not allowed to do reading or have an opinion except for the people that were on television? So that's like, I don't really care. Have your opinion, but then we should be allowed to test your opinion, especially if you're paid with government funds, like you were saying.
Part of it is, you notice this trope of like, well, all the experts agree. And we know from these professional associations that there are doctors who have been reprimanded for speaking out, for not following the guidelines. And then when that happens, they say like, well, they're not credible, so you can't listen to them. So they shrink the pool of experts that you're allowed to listen to. And with that, what you're getting a kind of a manufactured consensus, or an artificially shifted consensus.
Well, and I think we were able to disprove that quickly. From my personal experience, it was funny. I had by chance a medical appointment with a doctor, like I go and see once in a while. And I had just cross-examined the immunologist that the government used as an expert in the federal travel ban case. So I had Dr. Bridle give me like a tutorial about immunology and vaccinology, and his evidence was given. And then I was questioning this doctor. Her name was Bowdish too, but from Ontario, for 2 days. And like, I was conversant enough to be able to question these things. So I had seen him, and I was just like, you know what, if I would like to have a conversation with you about this. I have just had this opportunity to cross-examine the lead expert for the federal government, so all of Canada. And he's like, no offense, but you're a lawyer. And then I'm like, okay, well, what information, like, what are you basing your information on? And he basically said he didn't read anything else except for the guidelines from the college. So goes exactly to your point. It became such a small echo chamber, but he hadn't even read. I did more research than my own doctor.
Yeah.
And I'm like, at least I read at like 5 studies. I read this crazy expert report, like, thick, with all of like, she had tons of references. I had a like tutorial session on immunology. I've put in more effort than you, doctor. So you can't just read a publication from your college and say that you're informed. I don't think that's right. And I think we, again, going back to us and our obligation as citizens, we could have been challenging our doctors just on that question. Well, what did you read? Where are you getting that information from? Can I have that as well?
Yeah. That's so tough, because then you have at least the experience that I've had with my family and certain people in certain institutions or job roles that I've talked to about this. You run into the issue sometimes of like sounding like a conspiracy theorist, of sounding like your hair is all frazzly and you're like, well, actually, if you cross-reference this and that, but it shouldn't be that way, because it shows that you have a passion for something and you have the ability to synthesize information and find different sources. But there's such a inherent, and I don't know if this is just a product of particularly our culture. Like, Canada doesn't have as much of a kind of a free spirited, Wild West sort of culture as the US does, but we're not often given the benefit of the doubt when we say that we've researched something. It's often seen as like, oh, well, if you haven't followed the guidelines of the respected sources, then you're off in dreamland somewhere.
Yeah, I guess, and where I would just flip it is to say, well, show me. I'm always open to be proved wrong. Like, I don't care if I made, well, obviously I care, because I want to be, I don't want to be misinforming people. But if I've made an error, I would like to know that I was wrong, and I'm happy to have that conversation. So that's why I actually said I didn't tell him what I thought before. I said, I would like to have a conversation with you about this. And then when I found out what he was basing his opinion on, which was like a paragraph from the college, I was like, oh boy, like, clearly we can't have a conversation because you're not informed. You haven't informed yourself.
Yeah.
So like, if I wanted to, I could have just left him with some stuff too as well, or sent him some stuff. But okay, what is your opinion based on? Maybe let's start there. So that's how I would frame it.
Well, I mean, you have the epistemic humility, as they say, to have that opinion in the first place, and it feels like we're getting and I don't want to get too partisan about this, because sort of like we like to exist more in the conversational middle rather than picking sides. But kind of going back to Caulfield earlier, it certainly seems like there's one side of the conversation right now that definitely is not curious to find out where they've been wrong, and
Yeah.
there's another side that is sort of challenging that side to let's throw some sunlight on this. Let's have some public discussion. And one side seems a little more eager than the other to really drill down to the truth.
Yeah. And I'm glad you asked that, because I wanted to ask this before we wrap up, probably here in a bit, is how do we bridge it? I don't know if change it is the thing, but what can we do to get this conversation going? Or like, because so many times when I try to engage, I'm also told, don't do it. It's a waste of your time, which I do find it is often. Also, it's just so demeaning sometimes, the comments and the vitriol. And it's like, are you serious? Are we in grade 8? Like, I was in junior high. I wasn't the cool kid. I've been through that before. Thanks. Let's move on. Haha. You said my name funny. Great. Let's move on and have a discussion. Like, can we go there, do you think? Or are we like stuck in grade 8? Or I'm not even, actually, no, I'm not even going to put that to you. What can we do to change the conversation? Because I think anything is possible if we put in enough.
James is more moderate than me. He's more level-headed, so I'll let him lead with this one.
Excellent.
I just have a greater patience level to hammer down to the I'm a little bit stoic when it comes to conversations. I guess removing the emotion, that's my suggestion first, is that a lot of the times, so if somebody does engage a little bit, and if they try to attack you for like your character or this or that, or they throw a label on there, I don't engage with that. I try to just refocus on like, well, what do you mean by this? And like, kind of don't let it get into that, because as soon as you feed into that, it just amplifies into a big, just, it's a punching match at that point. And what isn't happening is, I try to be aware of like, are they actually representing your position? And if they're not, if somebody's attacking a version of your position in their head, try to point that out and be like, well, here's what I actually believe, and you're getting this wrong, or you're painting me with a wide brush. And often they will assume what you think based on kind of fitting you into a group, because it's more convenient in your head to assume that you're part of this group, you have this view, or you're from Alberta, so you believe this and that, and you're a conservative redneck and you believe this. And it's just these shortcuts that people will take. So I think that's part of it, is accurately framing somebody's position. And on our side as well, like when we're engaging in a conversation, what I try to do is I try to understand somebody's position, and I will steelman that. So present their position in the best possible light, and then poke a hole in it and say, this is where it fails. And if you can do that, then that shows that you've actually understood what they're trying to communicate.
Yeah, no, I think those are all fair. And it's so interesting, that one. I think the biggest or best example of that one I could give is being called right now an anti-vaxxer, or my client who is vaccine injured being called an anti-vaxxer. And I'm like, how do those words even come out of people's mouths? There's somebody injured from a vaccine. So clearly they're not and just that label is so silly anyway. But for me, it's, there was harm done, and we're trying to address the harm. And why are you so upset about that? And so that, very strange. Or like, even going back to the immigration thing, again, I don't really know how many people is right. But what I think we all want is a safe community. And I don't think that that's something we should be hesitant to talk about. If people feel unsafe to be walking the street or using public transportation, we should all be concerned about that or having a conversation about that. So that's where, like, I very much agree with you on that. It's surprising when people get stuck on that.
I can give you a guess as to why people would say things like calling a vaccine injured person an anti-vaxxer, because that type of person who would do that, who would say that, has so self-identified with an ideology that any example that could potentially lower the perfection that they've built that institution in their head is the enemy and needs to be, either silenced or censored or made fun of in some way. Because if you can admit that somebody's been vaccine injured, then that means when they're having an argument with their family member who, maybe had a problem with the COVID vaccines, well, then that means that they have a point, and they don't want them to have a point because they want to be right.
Getting back to silencing and the like Caulfield and others not having a conversation. And I think, yeah, so then that's the question. How can we manage having conversations that are difficult, that people don't want to engage, that will immediately attack? And I'm with you, James. I'm not going to be saying attacking them for it, but what can we do? And I know you guys, I think you don't mind sharing one idea that you guys had of what you could do. So maybe let's talk about that.
Yeah, that's a perfect segue. So we at the Critical Compass are big fans of a gentleman named Peter Boghossian. I don't know if you're familiar with him.
After I heard about what he does, yes.
Yeah. So he's, for listeners who aren't familiar, he's a former philosophy professor, taught at the Portland State University, I think it's called.
Yep.
There's some controversy there. You can read his Wikipedia; it's fine. But he's a sort of, I guess, a modern day. He employs the Socratic method. So, and the Socratic method being, of course, I don't need to tell you this, but for the listeners, just basically asking people questions until they fully refine their beliefs. Just question after question. Okay, well, why do you believe this? Okay, so you said that. So what about this? And what he does is a thing called spectrum street epistemology. And what it is he has he'll go on the street, or he'll go to a college, or he'll go to a group of his friends or some public setting, and he lays out I can't think of the name right now, but it's one of those surveys where it's like strongly disagree, slightly disagree, and then neutral, and then agree on the other side, as a horseshoe shape. And he makes a claim and he counts down and gets people to self-assemble on the line of how much they agree or disagree with the claim. And then he asks them questions. Okay, you believe this. Why are your beliefs this way? Talk to somebody else. And then he'll ask them, say somebody on the strongly agree side, well, what would it take for you? What would that person on the disagree line have to say to get you to move 1 degree over from the assuredness you have of your position? And he's doing another thing that's pretty cool now too, where if he ever has people who go on very strongly opposite ends of the spectrum, what he makes them do before he asks their opinion is he has them write down on a whiteboard what they believe their opponent's strongest position is for being on that side. So it immediately gets you in a framework of, like James was saying, of steel manning someone's argument that you very strongly oppose. So we want to start doing that. I think as far as we know, there's no one doing that in Alberta, at least not on YouTube that we found so far. So maybe we'll be the first. And I think it'll be fun.
I think it'll be fun too. And it just gets the conversation going. And it's okay to have disagreements and different opinions. In fact, that is healthy. That's how we learn. That's how we could grow. So I think that having those kind of discussions and making it fun, going on campuses or on White Average Asper, would be very entertaining. So I'm looking forward to that and maybe doing a few with you.
Yes, that'd be awesome. Before we plug a few things for you, James, do you have any final questions you'd like to ask Eva?
I think we've covered quite a bit. So
right on. Well, Eva, I'll let you do your sign off, but before you do, because I don't know if you would do it yourself. Let's say, when is your book coming out? Where can people buy it? What other things do you got going on?
Those are the tough questions. Hopefully soon. It was supposed to be released May, June, and there might be a little bit delay that isn't for sure yet. So, but soon. I so want it out just because, like I said, I want people to read it. I'm doing courses, Empowered Canadians, just to help elevate the conversation, and then, of course, involved in these class actions that I've talked about. And then just trying to have these conversations and engage with people and have some fun on the internet as well with that. And where can everybody find you? That's what I was going to ask.
We are on Twitter /X. You can find us at the Crit Comp. It's the closest we could get. The Critical Compass was too long, and everything related was already taken. So TheCritComp, and the Critical Compass on YouTube.
All right. And I'll put your handle in. So that was really great. Thank you, guys. That was a fun way of doing it and having this dialogue. And we're going to still hold on to you guys for a little bit longer for the paid X subscribers, where we like to get a little bit more juicy with the questions.
Nice. Thanks,
Perfect.
Eva. Appreciate your time.
Thanks,
it was
guys.
great. Cheers.